I'm Ryan Urbanowitz, and welcome to this basic introduction to scientific research in a lab. This high-level introduction will mostly be of interest to students and staff who are interested in or just getting started with research in a laboratory. So first off, what is research? Well, simply, it's an attempt to discover new or better answers to questions or solutions to problems. While education is an essential component of research, it's important to note that education is not equivalent to research. So why get into research? Well, first off, it's a chance to be a part of discovery and innovation in our world. And also, it's a great opportunity to gain a broad set of marketable skills that, in a broad sense, include critical thinking, communication, teamwork and leadership, teaching, and design. To better illustrate the relationship between education and research, let's first imagine that this circle contains and represents all current human knowledge. Starting off in elementary school, we get to learn and know a little bit about our world. And in high school, we get to learn and know a little bit more. In pursuing a bachelor's degree as an undergraduate student, or in going to a trade school, we'll gain an even stronger interdisciplinary base of knowledge, as well as gain a specialty, where we learn a lot more about a more specific topic. A master's degree is an opportunity to deepen that specialty. Most of what we've learned up to this point can be found in textbooks, where the knowledge that's found in textbooks has typically been better vetted and stood the test of time. No matter what level we're starting at when we get into research, whether it be high school, as an undergrad, or a graduate student, in order to do research, we first need to reach the boundary of human knowledge. This is where new research happens. We start off with an observation or some target question we're trying to answer. This research question could be self-motivated, something the student came up with themselves, or it could come from the experience and direction of a mentor, often the principal investigator or PI of a laboratory. Making an observation and asking a target research question is also the start of the scientific method. Once we have a research direction, we need to get to the boundary of human knowledge. This is done through background research, where we try to read and understand everything that is specifically relevant to our research question. This includes other research and knowledge that won't be found in textbooks. So ultimately, the best way to get to the boundary of human knowledge is to read research papers. However, not all literature sources are going to be equally good for helping you get to the boundary of human knowledge. The best source comes from primary literature. This is original research and/or other publications of new scientific discoveries. These are basically first-hand accounts of research having been conducted. Examples include original research in peer-reviewed journals. Also, it includes dissertations, technical reports, and conference proceedings. The well-known journal Nature is one of many journals that includes peer-reviewed primary source literature, which are the best sources defining the boundary of human knowledge. Beyond primary is secondary literature. These sources summarize and synthesize the primary literature. These publications or articles are usually broader and less current than primary literature. These can include review articles, books, and even magazines like Popular Science. And then there's also tertiary literature, which further summarizes or condenses versions of materials. They also usually include references to primary or secondary sources, and tertiary literature is often a good place to look up facts or get a general overview of a subject. Examples here include textbooks, dictionaries, encyclopedias, and handbooks. A great digital example of this is Wikipedia. Another useful thing to know is the difference between a review and research article, where a research article represents primary literature and a review represents secondary literature. Both have similar formatting and citations. However, a review paper is going to summarize and clarify a body of primary source research. In doing so, it often provides opinions on the importance of work and future directions of research. Review papers are a great starting point for students and researchers to find existing primary source literature. On the other hand, in primary research articles, authors conducted the actual research themselves, and they're the source of brand new findings, methods, and conclusions. No matter where you're starting in your education, to get to that boundary, we need to conduct a literature search or review of the relevant background material. The first consideration here is the availability of access to those different kinds of literature. Some articles are open access, and they're freely available for anyone to access and read. However, most journals have a publisher paywall. You may have to pay a monthly or annual subscription to a journal, or pay-as-you-go access to individual articles. However, very likely, if you're at an institution, like a college, university, or company, you'll have prepaid access to most or even all of the relevant research literature. However, if you don't, you can always try contacting one of the authors of a specific paper to see if they'd be willing to send you a copy. Next, how do we go about searching for relevant publications? For this, it's important to learn to use a scientific or academic search engine, such as Google Scholar, PubMed, or Microsoft Academic. You can also look for primary source articles that are cited in review papers you've read, or talk with other members of the lab, your PI, or collaborators to help point you towards some of the relevant literature. Another consideration is that not all literature will be of the same quality, even if they're published in peer-reviewed journals. So how do we go about identifying higher quality research? Well, in general, journals with a higher impact score are often viewed as containing higher quality research. However, it's important to note that this is not always going to be the case. You can find many excellent research works, even in journals with a much lower impact score. Additionally, publications that have a larger number of citations can indicate a higher level of quality and interest in that work. Of course, when you're looking at the number of citations a publication has received, make sure that you're taking the year that it was published into account. Another tip is to simply take notes and make your own bibliography as you explore the literature. At minimum, it's useful to track the first author, the year the paper was published, as well as some of the main ideas, experiments, or results that you want to make note of from the paper. Next, let's talk about a few tips for reading a research article. First off, I recommend quickly skimming a paper. And this is basically to answer the question, is this paper relevant to your current research, and thus is it worth the time investment of reading it in more detail? Here's a summary of the typical anatomy of a scientific paper. Papers begin with a title and information about the authors, including the contact information of at least one corresponding author. Next, there's the abstract, which is a brief summary of the study and its findings. Next, we have the longer introduction section, which is a statement about what's currently known about the study's subject and articulates the questions being investigated. Here, the author cites other relevant scholarly works and lays the foundation for the rest of the study, often stating the hypothesis they intend to test. The introduction often includes background information that can help someone newer to the field become better oriented to read the rest of the paper. Depending on the type of paper, next the reader might find the results section or perhaps the methods section. The results section is simply a description of the research conducted and the results obtained. Results are typically summarized in tables, figures, graphs, and supporting or supplemental materials can include larger data sets, videos, additional tables and figures, photographs, etc. The methods section is a detailed description of how the studies were conducted, with sufficient details that others can replicate the work. In the discussion section, which is sometimes combined with conclusions, the author summarizes the analysis and their interpretation, integrating these new results with prior findings from other studies. Here, the authors can also lay out new hypotheses to be tested in future work. Publications can also include a few other sections, such as acknowledgments, author contributions, potential conflicts of interest, and information about data accessibility. Typically, at the very end of a paper, you'll find the references. These are a list of the other articles or materials that are cited in the paper so that proper credit is given to that other work. Once you've skimmed the paper, I recommend you read sections in an order that suits your own needs and experience. In other words, you don't have to read them in the order presented in the paper. Generally, it's best to start with the abstract, since this provides a quick summary of the paper as a whole. Next, if you're new to the field in particular, move on to the introduction. This will help you better understand the problem, question, relevant related work, and the goal of the current paper. Early on, I also recommend jumping to the discussion and/or conclusions at the end of the paper. This can help you more quickly assess whether the authors found anything useful or relevant to the area of your investigation. And lastly, move on to the details of the paper, found in both the methods or results section. Typically, I'd recommend just going with the order that they're presented in the paper. However, you might focus on the methods section if you're involved in methodological research, or you might focus on the results if your primary interest is applications research. Some last tips for reading a research article. If you get stuck on specific terminology used in the paper, you can always turn to Google or Wikipedia to help yourself out. And make sure as you read papers that you stay organized. Often I like to print out papers and use a highlighter, make notes in the margins, or write on sticky notes so that I can quickly find key ideas when downstream I get to writing my own paper, and need to quickly find where those specific ideas came from in the literature that I read. After a literature search, at this point we've reached the boundary of human knowledge regarding our specific question of interest. So now let's zoom in here at the boundary. Reaching this boundary helps us to ensure that our research hasn't already been done before. It will help us write the introduction of our own research paper when we go to publish our research progress, and we can also take our efforts in conducting a literature search to write our own review paper to frame and summarize a body of primary source articles on our topic or research of interest. So now let's get back to our research itself, where we have a specific research question we're trying to address. We've identified our question, and we've conducted background research. So from here, we're going to move on to other phases of the scientific method. Next, we form a hypothesis, where we make a prediction about the answer to our target question or problem. Next, we develop a procedure to test our hypothesis, and then go ahead with conducting that experiment. Next, we analyze the data that we've recorded. This might involve summarizing the results, conducting statistical analyses, including comparisons of statistical significance, and generating tables, figures, or other summaries of the results so that others can more easily understand the outcome of our experiment. And lastly, we move forward with reporting our conclusions. In other words, was our hypothesis correct? And how does the evidence support or not support the original hypothesis made? This is also a good point to summarize all the steps so far in applying the scientific method, and figuring out how to communicate these either to your mentor, your local research group, or possibly to the world in the form of a publication. However, often research fails to turn out as we expect, and the process of conducting research becomes a cycle of asking new questions, generating hypotheses, running experiments, analyzing the data, and then using conclusions to ask some new question. Once we've convincingly answered one or more questions, we'll likely be ready to write up a publication. Now it's worth taking a moment to ask what makes research so difficult. Well, first off, the boundary of current human knowledge isn't always clear. Research on your area of interest could be widely distributed across the primary source literature, and it can be difficult to both find as well as to understand once you've found it. After all, it's only over time, with interest, replication, and vetting, that new knowledge makes it into review papers and textbooks. Furthermore, there's no clear roadmap for research. We have to figure out for ourselves what makes a good scientific question, as well as what's the best approach to answering this question. And of course, unlike in the classroom, there is no answer key. As researchers, we have to ask ourselves how much confidence we have in the evidence we collect and the conclusions we're making, and is what we've gathered enough to convince our peers in research. So back to our boundary of human knowledge. Let's say that our application of the scientific method has led to some new knowledge that we've discovered with sufficient evidence to back up our conclusion. Now we've finally made a dent in the boundary of human knowledge, and now it's up to us to share that knowledge with our research community and the world at large. So what are some ways of going about communicating our research findings? The gold standard is publishing peer-reviewed research papers. These can include journal papers, short reports or letters, conference or workshop papers, book chapters, and abstracts for works in progress. Furthermore, now it's common for an author to publish their paper online as a preprint, which notably is not yet peer-reviewed. However, this can be a useful way to get your research out there. At the same time, this can help prevent you from getting what's called scooped, where somebody else publishes the same result before you get a chance to, thus getting credit for the advancement. Researchers can also communicate their findings through other forms of documentation, including supplemental materials, typically connected to a journal research paper, as well as user guides for software or other technologies, and organizing code or other materials in a GitHub repository. Another basic form of scientific communication are oral presentations. These include invited talks, accepted conference talks. These can also include internal talks, where you talk about your research either within your home department or even just within your laboratory. There's also poster presentations, recording YouTube videos, podcasts, and a number of other possibilities. And another modern form of scientific communication is through social media. Now let's take a look at what makes research publishable, starting with some of the basic standards. The first is novelty. Is this work actually new? Is there something closely relatable or equivalent in some other area of study? When we go to publish, we want to make sure that we always acknowledge and compare our work to other related work, methods, or findings. The next standard is validity. By this, I mean, have we succeeded in measuring what was planned? And have we accurately portrayed the collection of our evidence? This also includes the strength of our conclusion. Is our conclusion convincingly backed by our evidence? And a third basic standard of publishable research is reproducibility. Can others repeat the same experiments and get the same or very similar results? If you get the opportunity to write a research manuscript, this slide includes some basic tips on how to go about writing the individual sections of a research paper. The title should be brief, specific, and self-explanatory. The abstract should be short and concise, and it should focus on the actual work done by the authors, along with one or two lines informing the relevance or importance of the work. Papers are also usually tagged with some keywords to help other researchers find research that's relevant to theirs. Next, the introduction of a paper is sometimes difficult to balance in length, as it should not dominate the paper, but it should give the reader enough background to understand the importance of the current work and information about other previously completed relevant works. The methods section should describe the materials and methods used to conduct the experiment, again with enough detail so that others could repeat the research. The results section, which sometimes gets merged with the discussion, should lay out summaries of the data with tables and figures, as well as an objective summary of the findings of the experiments. The discussion can more subjectively elaborate on the results, integrating them with previous work, and laying out potential work and hypotheses for the future. In the conclusions section, we again want to be brief, summarizing the research conducted and how the results support the conclusion, either demonstrating or disproving the hypothesis. Next, the reference section includes all the citations needed that were pointed to throughout the paper. This is a very important part of primary source research articles. Make sure that when writing the paper as a whole, that you're not copying any text from other papers. And in the rare situation that a short quote benefits the paper, make sure to include that text in quotations with a proper citation of the original paper. It's considered bad practice and borderline unethical to even grab text that you've written in previous papers and copy it into new ones. So when writing a research paper, it's always best to write from scratch in your own voice. There's also automated plagiarism checking software to give you some peace of mind before you finally submit your publication for review. If you're brand new to research, you're probably not going to be diving immediately into writing an entire scientific research paper. Instead, most likely the thing that you're going to be practicing first is writing an abstract for your research. This is a short summary of the entire research as a whole. I like to think of an abstract like a funnel, the start of which is relevant to the widest audience possible, quickly focusing the reader to the specific research, results, and conclusions of the current work. An abstract should be 1 to 2 paragraphs, starting with an introduction to the topic, then pointing to a gap in the current literature that this current research tries to fill, then a brief summary of the methods, as well as the study results, and lastly offering a brief, typically 1-sentence conclusion. You can think of an abstract kind of like a trailer for a movie, meant to grab the attention and interest of a potential reader. However, it's critical that an abstract not mislead readers or misrepresent the research. Now that we've covered the basics of scientific communication, let's talk briefly about the publishing process itself. This is going to start from the point where we've applied our scientific method and generated enough evidence where we feel that we can convincingly make a conclusion that will convince our scientific peers. Early on in the research itself, and certainly at the beginning of preparing a paper, the researchers should identify who the authors of the paper will be. Paper authorship is a really important part of scientific career advancement. While having any authorship position on a scientific paper is valuable, the position of first and last author are the most coveted, where the first author position is reserved for the person who did the majority of the research and writing, while the last author position is typically reserved for the lab's PI, who typically oversees and gets involved in all aspects of the research, and who is ultimately responsible for the quality of the research published. Different journals can have different requirements regarding what constitutes sufficient contributions to be included as an author on a research paper. This can also differ from institution to institution and lab to lab. So if you're new to a research lab and gaining authorship on a paper is of importance to you, it's worth having these discussions with your principal investigator early on in the process. Next, we start preparing our manuscript. One or more of the authors could be involved in this draft process. This includes writing the different sections of the papers that we've mentioned, generating the figures, tables, and the references. It can also include assembling a supplementary materials document, as well as organizing and documenting any code or other detailed procedures that readers might need to know about in order to fully replicate the research. After the first draft is complete, you'll want to get feedback and edits from all of the authors, as well as the principal investigator of the lab. Based on this feedback and set of edits, typically the first author goes about revising the paper as needed until a final or polished draft is completed. This process of revising the paper could potentially take a number of cycles, as new issues might be identified, new questions are asked, and new experiments might need to be conducted before a final and polished paper is realized. Lastly, once you have a final draft in hand, it's best practice to run a plagiarism check just to cover your bases. At this point, the authors can also consider publishing a preprint, for instance on arXiv. This involves formatting the paper according to preprint standards and submitting it online, where usually it's available to the world in 1 or 2 days. The authors can use a preprint as a way of getting feedback from people outside their lab, and they can use this feedback to further revise their paper before submitting it to a journal. And lastly, we're ready to submit our manuscript to a target journal or conference for peer review. So now let's take a look at the peer review process for publication. This starts with the author submitting their manuscript to a journal. This typically goes to an editor of the journal who determines whether the manuscript is suitable in terms of formatting, interest, topic, and basic quality. If it's deemed not suitable, this is called a desk rejection. In this case, the manuscript can be returned to the authors in a matter of days or weeks. If it is deemed suitable, the paper is then sent for peer review to 2 or more ideally impartial or blind reviewers. These reviewers shouldn't have a conflict of interest with the authors of the paper. These reviewers carefully read the paper and prepare comments for both the authors and the editor of the journal. Once all reviews are received, the journal editor checks the reviewer's report and recommendations, usually deciding whether to accept the paper without changes, which is pretty rare, or the recommendation could be to revise and resubmit to address either minor or major revisions, as indicated by the reviewers. If revisions were called for, reviewers may again be asked to read the paper and make a final decision as to whether it should be accepted or rejected. And lastly, the recommendation could be to reject the paper. If a paper is rejected, sometimes the journal won't accept that paper again in any form. At this point, the authors might consider rerunning experiments or dramatically revising the paper before trying to resubmit it to another journal. While going about this whole process of research and publication, it's very important to keep ethical considerations in mind. Some of the greatest crimes we want to avoid in research is the harm of research subjects, committing fraud, possibly by the manufacturing of data or results, and committing plagiarism, where we take credit for somebody else's work. Among many ethical considerations, it's important to ensure that we always properly cite our work. We take steps to protect the privacy of our subjects or patient data, for example, by making sure that we have the proper training and permission to handle any sensitive data. We also want to ensure honesty in our work and always be mindful of potential sources of bias, which can come from many sources, including ourselves. If you're interested in making a career out of research, one of the major avenues is to start by getting a PhD. Making that dent on the boundary of human knowledge is a hallmark of what constitutes the achievement of a PhD degree. Additionally, earning a PhD typically involves the following: carrying out a literature review, conducting original research and collecting your results, producing a thesis that presents your conclusions, writing up your thesis and submitting it as a dissertation, and defending your thesis in an oral exam, both publicly and with a private panel of experts in your field. However, after completing a research project, and especially after completing a PhD, your perspective of the world can look a lot different. So it's important not to forget the bigger picture. Even if you've earned a PhD degree, the learning process always continues, both in your area of expertise and in unrelated fields. Ongoing learning and education is important to developing new ideas, perspective, and of course conducting interdisciplinary research. If you're new or newer to research, it can be useful to understand some of the big picture goals of a scientific research lab in academia. One of the major goals, of course, is to contribute to the research community. This can be through the discovery of new knowledge or the development of new methods, materials, or technologies. Another major goal is to publish. You've probably heard the expression publish or perish. In most labs, publishing in higher impact, peer-reviewed journals is the priority. Another major goal is to obtain funding. This can sometimes be from the institution itself or more likely from grants, such as the National Institutes of Health. To obtain grants, it's often necessary for labs to generate preliminary data to back up their grant applications and convincingly demonstrate that the lab can achieve its stated goals. Obtaining funding also allows the lab to expand, hire new staff and students, gather the resources it needs to conduct research, and ensures the longevity of the lab in general. Yet another goal is the development of educational resources. These resources could take many forms, from course development to writing textbooks and generating YouTube videos like this one. The goal here is to prepare the next generation of researchers for academia and industry, as well as to promote the lab's research and provide networking in order to get students interested in the research, as well as to help find new collaborators for the lab to work with in the future. I'll end this video by highlighting some ways that you as a researcher can make valuable contributions to a research lab. First off, take ownership of your work or project. Take initiative, both in terms of comprehension of the project's big picture and details, as well as setting progress goals and deadlines for yourself. Additionally, balancing teamwork with self-reliance and independence. Also take notes, be responsive, and ask for clarifications whenever you need them. And of course, learn as much as you can, and share or teach your own unique skills to others in the group. Another important aspect is keeping your work organized and well documented. This is because, most importantly, anything published needs to be reproducible. And furthermore, follow best practices in research. This includes honesty, transparency, reproducibility, clear communication, and constructive skepticism. Additionally, whenever the opportunity presents itself, I'd encourage you to participate in scientific communication. This includes manuscript writing, giving talks or short presentations, as well as maybe even helping with grant preparation. Furthermore, embrace opportunities to fail, grow, and go outside your comfort zone. Learning from failure and troubleshooting is a central daily struggle in research. And lastly, speak up if you think you've made or spotted a mistake. After all, everyone makes mistakes, even experienced principal investigators. Avoid making assumptions about the quality of any previous work conducted either outside or inside your lab. This helps us to improve the overall quality and trustworthiness of research. Thanks for joining me for this basic introduction to scientific research. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions or you're interested in future collaboration.